We're
Good morning.
live,
We're live. I
back
skipped
for
the
another
intro. I'm
Feuertips.
sorry. I didn't give you that heads up with the countdown. Here we are.
No
Good
worries. We don't
morning,
we don't need
Stephen.
a countdown to get started. We can just go. I mean, I've got code. I've got a favorite book. I've got dogs. Oh, we are so set to go.
All right.
So,
How are you
welcome
doing?
everybody
Good
to our
week?
weekly escape from the suboptimal state of our world. We can escape into our software and enjoy PL SQL, and even get mad at PL SQL and Oracle database, and that's okay. So let's see. Any news from last week? Anything we should chat about before we dive into cursor for loops?
Nothing exciting other than we've been battling round 2 of COVID in this
Oof.
household. So definitely, get vaccinated, stay safe. It's still out there. It is not fun. And we're super, super, super careful. But, kids in school and so yeah, but we're recovering and
Glad to hear
doing
it. Yeah, I
okay.
talked to a cousin of mine a few days ago, and it turns out his parents had just come back from a cruise. A cruise. Came back with COVID. They were fully vaccinated. He was in bad shape for 10 days. He was in the hospital. So,
Mm.
and people are saying, forget about masks. Even where I live, where mask wearing is pretty good. It's like the only place in North Carolina probably where it is or has been. The mask mandate is gone. People are largely going without masks, but not me. I'm not going into any indoor locations besides trusted spaces without a mask. We're still getting 30,000 cases a day in the United States, 600
Mhm.
people dying. Do you want to be one of those people? No. Okay. So
All right.
wear a mask. And if anybody bothers you in the United States about wearing a mask, ask them, do you believe in freedom? Because I believe in freedom and I should be free to wear a mask. Moving on. Okay. So for PL SQL, for the Feuertips today, I thought I'd go back to one of the classic, wonderful features of PL SQL, which is the cursor for loop. So as many of you may know, PL SQL came from another language. So Oracle was smart enough way back in the late 80s to say, we need a language on top of SQL, or let's say between SQL and C, because at that point, people were writing C code on top of Oracle, on top of SQL to build applications. And it caused all sorts of problems. Anyway, we want language where you can write it once and run it everywhere. That's not Java, that's PL SQL. Anyway, they decided we're not going to design a whole new language of our own. We're going to look for models of languages. They picked Ada, which was a language designed for the Department of Defense in the United States, but cool. And then they adapted it to be a database programming language. And one of the key ways that they adapted or extended, in a sense, you could say, is with the for loop. Everybody knows about the numeric for loop for I in 1 to 10 do X, Y, or Z. Or if you're on 21C, you can now do about a gazillion different crazy iterators in that numeric for loop. So what they did was take that idea of a numeric for loop, iterate through this range of values, and extended it for SQL. So you can say for every row identified by this query, do something. Really sweet stuff. So it's a great feature of PL SQL. It demonstrates the tight integration. People love it, and I love it because it does a lot of work for you implicitly. I don't have to open the cursor. I don't have to do individual fetches. I don't have to ask, am I done? I don't have to close the cursor when I'm done, all that kind of stuff, which is nice. We'll go exploring. But you can also run into, let's say, misuses. There was a reference to the joys and horrors of the cursor for loop. There's only one real horror that I know about that we'll dive into. But so let's go ahead and show my screen. And let's take a look at some code. So I'll just run through the basics of the cursor for loop real quickly. Then we'll explore some interesting aspects which you may or may not be aware of. So here's the basic idea. For every record in, and obviously you can name this whatever you want. You can even name it I, which I suggest you don't do, even if it's a numeric for loop. Whoops, dog, get off of keyboard. Okay, so for every...
Egle was commenting on Sochi. He was
I saw him
climbing up
running
on
around
me
back
and
there, yeah.
barking.
So for every row in the employees table, do this. And that's it. No open, fetch, close. You can also declare the cursor explicitly. So for every record in my explicit cursor. And of course, you can declare the cursor in a package and then reference the packaged cursor, all that good stuff. You can even, in case you didn't know this, doesn't have to do with cursor for loops, but you can even hide the select statement when you declare a cursor in your package spec. I can just tell it what type of data it returns, just like a function. And then inside my package body, I can have the body of the select statement in my cursor, which is another way of saying or reminding us, by the way, that a select statement is really the same as a function, logically speaking. You pass in bind values, you return data, off you go. Okay, so that's the basic idea behind the cursor for loop. Now, One of the concerns you might have about a cursor for loop is, let's say there were 100,000 rows in the employees table. So what I'm going to do then is row by row fetching of data from that table. And as everybody knows, if you've been around for any length of time and you remember a guy named Tom Kite, he came up with this famous quote, row by row equals slow by slow. It's a slow way to do stuff with the database, this row by row operation. Good news though, in Oracle 10G, when Oracle added automatic optimization and a lot of other great features to the compiler in PL SQL, they also did automatic optimization of cursor for loops. And let's go over to Live SQL and let's see if I can find, I think I've got a script that shows this cursor for loop. So if you search for cursor for loop in good old Live SQL, we find a few different things we'll look at, but here's the first one I want to show you, automatic optimization. Now, so I built this a long time ago, created 6.4 years ago. And the basic idea, without going through a lot of the details of it, that we compare different ways of querying. And I just realized that this gray text is hard to read. So we'll go back to SQL Developer. So here's the basic idea. Let's say there are roughly 3 ways to iterate through rows. So I can do a cursor for loop with row by row operations, just incrementing a counter. I can do an explicit cursor and then a simple or infinite loop, or it could be an infinite loop. So just loop, and then exit when I don't find a row anymore. Or we've got this great new feature in 10G that everybody hopefully knows about, which is bulk collect, or in this case, fetch bulk collect, in which I can specify how many rows I fetch at a time. So 3 different approaches, and then we can basically run this performance tester with our different inputs. So if we go back over to Live SQL, what you'll see if you look at the results is that here's a run without optimization. So I'm going to turn off optimization in the database, just like it was prior to 10G. And then you can see that my implicit cursor for loop is roughly the same as the explicit, but way slower than bulk fetch. But if I go back to my default optimization level and run again, check it out. Now my implicit performance is basically the same as my bulk performance, and my explicit performance is still low. So stop sharing my screen for just a moment. So there are a couple of points to draw from here. One is that, wow, it's really great that Oracle does this for us automatically, so you don't have to think about converting all your cursor for loops to bulk collects. The second thing to point out is that if you try to run this again now on later versions of Oracle Database, you won't see that much of a difference. I could run it in 21C on my computer, but the delta between optimized and non-optimized is actually getting very narrow because the whole engine is getting so much faster. So you probably won't see this kind of enormous benefit in 18, 19 and above, but earlier it was much greater. And the third point I want to make has to do with just a basic coding concept, which is to always use declarative constructs whenever possible. So in a sense, one of the best things about the cursor for loop is that it's declarative. It says, hey, Oracle, find all the rows identified by this query and do this. Don't give me the details about how you do it and don't expect me to do it for you. That's what I want done, which is very similar to the language conceptually that we use with SQL. Hey, database engine, get me all these rows for this particular where clause and this ordering, but I'm not going to tell you how to do it. Now, there are 2 big advantages of declarative programming. One is you don't have to write so much code. You just tell it what you want, and the underlying engine does the work for you. But the second wonderful thing is demonstrated with this optimization. Because I used the implicit cursor for loop is a declarative construct, and I didn't tell the compiler how to do its job, the compiler could optimize that code. But when I'm working with something like this, my explicit approach, so I'm telling Oracle each step of the way, I'm going to do it for you. Open now, Oracle. Fetch now, Oracle. Close now, Oracle. Because I've gotten into the inner algorithmic processing of that data, they cannot safely optimize that code. So if you always look for the highest declarative way to program in any construct, but certainly there's more and more of that in PL SQL, the better off you will be. Okay, so let's see. Let's go into a couple of curiosities now. Let's take a look at cursor attributes when you're working with a cursor for loop. So as I'm sure you know, let's do the implicit ones first. So as I'm sure you know, there's the SQL cursor. That's basically reflects the last SQL statement you've executed or are executing. And there are a number of attributes. Is it open? Is the cursor open? Did you find a row the last time you fetched? Did you not find a row? How many rows have you fetched to date? So this is pretty interesting, and I'm probably gonna have to reconnect. And let's do reconnect. You may be surprised at what you find when it finishes reconnecting. There we go, excellent. So let's run this script. So I'm gonna basically run through, use a cursor for loop, and then show the attributes in each one. And I've got 2 rows in my table. On my script. And here's what we see. Inside a cursor for loop, it's the SQL attributes, the implicit cursor attributes are worthless. You get no information about it. It's basically invisible when it's a cursor for loop. So let's say, okay, what do we do then? How about if we have a cursor, an explicit cursor, and I fetch from that cursor in a cursor for loop, and then I see the cursor attributes for each one of those. Let's see how that works. So here's my cursor, %found, cursor not found. Okay, so now what you can see is that you get information. So inside the cursor, I'm going through my iterations. Inside the cursor, is it open? Sure. Did I find a row? Yes. What's my row count? Et cetera, et cetera. You can see this. So that's great. You have access to that information inside the loop, but big deal. You're inside the loop. Of course, you still got data. Of course, the cursor's open, right? It's really not telling you all that much. And the sad thing here to realize is that once you're out of the cursor, so once you hit the end loop, down here, that cursor is closed. There's no more information about what happened inside the loop. And that's one of the downsides of the cursor for loop, is that it's kind of a black box. And if you need to come out of that loop and know about what happened, you have to add additional code. For example, how many rows did I fetch? Oh, well, if I want to know how many rows I fetched in the cursor for loop, I've got to write my own little incrementer inside the loop to get that information. SQL %row count will not work. Cur %row count will not work because the cursor is closed. So there's a bit of a trade-off there in that it black boxes it because it's implicit processing, so you don't have access to the individual steps. It also black boxes it around information you can get after the loop terminates. Okay, so let's move on to what I would consider to be the horror, as close as we can come to horror when it comes to cursor for loops. And that has to do with when to use a cursor for loop. So, or let's talk about more generally when to use loops. Can you stop sharing my screen for a second? Because I figure if I'm going to talk for a long time without showing you code, you should just look at my pretty face. So here's the thing to think about when you're working with loops in PL SQL or loops in any kind of program, is that the message when I see the word loop is, I'm going to do something a number of times, multiple iterations. Now, it could be that under some circumstances, they're just one iteration, but the code is written to say, we're going to do things one or more times, most likely more times. Now, the other thing about loops is that when you're doing optimization, code optimization, performance optimization, loops are one of the main places you want to look because you're doing things multiple times. So any poor performance of an individual line in your loop body will be magnified by the number of times of execution. So loops have a particular significance conceptually, semantically in your code, and they have a special significance from things like optimization and maintenance. So here's the thing that I find really odd. Over and over again, I notice that people will write code using a cursor for loop to get a single row. Share my screen. Let's take a look. So maybe you do this, maybe you don't do it. I continue to run into it, and I run into it in surprising places. From what I can tell, there's a fair amount of single row queries in some of the Oracle code I've seen. I won't say where I've seen it. And from other people I respect greatly. And it's always kind of puzzled me. And so here's an example, and we'll maybe talk about the pluses and minuses. And really, if any of you do use cursor for loops to fetch a single row and you want to defend that position, let's hear about it in the chat. We'll turn off my ringer too. Okay, so here's a function, get the last name of an employee. Not hard stuff, right? So what I want to do though is I don't want to declare any variables. I don't want to have to select into the variable and then return the variable, this, that, and the other. And I know I'm always going to find a row. So what could be simpler? For every record in, there's my single row fetch, return the last name. Now, you could look at that and say, oh, that's pretty neat. That's quite elegant. Minimal coding, but how would you do this? I will never, ever do this. Now, this is probably the best case scenario justifying a cursor for loop for a single row lookup. And even then, we're going to talk about some of the downsides of it. I've usually seen it as the first step in a larger procedure. So get a value and then continue to use the value. And then I think it's even worse because of the flow, the issues around flow that I'll talk about here in a minute. And also that it, again, fundamentally, it looks weird. Here, you might say, it doesn't look weird because I know I'm just getting the last name and I'm returning it. So if my eyes will just look at this code, no problem. But if it's part of a bigger program and I suddenly hit a cursor for loop, I'm automatically thinking about multiple rows, multiple rows. But wait, the where clause, that's not multiple rows. And what it does then is confuse a person reading your code. You never want your code to confuse people unless you want to obfuscate it without using obfuscation or wrapping. I assume you don't. You want code that answers questions, doesn't raise questions. So to me, that's one of the fundamental problems with using a cursor for loop for a one-row lookup. It's too darn confusing. Now, what's the alternative? So here's the alternative that I think most of us would rely on. Select into, single row lookup, and then it simply returns the last name. Yes, I have to declare the variable. Is it more code than this? Not really. And then again, I can also use an explicit cursor. So there's my cursor declaration, declare my variable, fetch into, and return. So there are at least these three different ways. I suppose we could look at doing a bulk collect and return the first row fetched in the collection, but we won't go further around that. But let's talk about some of the consequences of your choices. So generally speaking, when you're doing a single row lookup, there are three conditions. One is, got it, I found the row. Second condition is, oh, no row found, no data found exception. And the third is too many rows. I should have just gotten one, but I got more than one. What's going wrong? And that raises the too many rows exception. Now, one of the biggest problems with using a cursor for loop for this kind of one row lookup is that it makes it very difficult to implement logic around too many rows and no data found. So if we scroll down here a little bit, remember, there's no way to know what happened inside your black box cursor for loop after it executes. So, so in this case, this is interesting, right? Let's suppose that in my function, now that I've written this code, now I have to deal with no data found in too many rows. How do I do?
And by the way, Stephen Udit is actually making that very point, that if there's no data found, the outcome is different.
Right.
Different implementation.
Thank you. Right. So clearly, what I've shown you is the very simple approach in which the assumption is it's working right. And that psychologically, that's something that a lot of us tend to rely on, even if we don't realize it. We just want to assume that things will go right and not go wrong. Probably one of the biggest failings as developers is, well, we're human. That's our biggest failing as developers. So we have the same human fallacies brought to our code, which is we're always going to think that everything's going to be great. Yes, so different behaviors when things go wrong. So how can I deal with no data found with this approach? Well, it turns out actually it's pretty elegant, simple. Here we go. What would you think of a function that looked like this? Cursor for loop. The return is inside my loop body. And if I get to the end of my function, I raise no data found. Is that cool or what? Wow. I would not want to have to maintain code like that. Let's go back to what it was. But that's how I would handle a no or raise no data found. What about too many rows? Now there we really have a problem. If there's a possibility of too many rows and I need to trap the exception and log it, and generally when you get too many rows on a single row query, there's something badly wrong with your data. Could be your endeavor test and your data is just bad, which is still a problem. Could be production, and then your problem is way worse. There's really no way that I can think of to get too many rows from within here. I could say, I could have a counter. I got the first one, save it to a variable. If I get to the second one, raise too many rows. But that avoids the whole issue or obviates the whole advantage of using the cursor for loop in this way. Depending on the kind of code you're writing, it could work differently, and you could trap for too many rows in a different way. But I think this really demonstrates as clearly as possible the downside of using a cursor for loop for one row. In the simplest possible cases where everything goes great, maybe it's okay. Every other scenario, it's just going to create problems for you. So avoid doing it. Harkening back to, I think it was my first Feuer tip, this is an example of really bad lazy. Bad lazy, yes. Okay, so to finish up, and not too many comments today. All right, that's all right. I thought I'd show you. Sorry?
Quiet crowd.
A quiet crowd. I'm just overwhelming them with my wisdom and brilliance. It happens. So I was out on Twitter this morning getting ready to promote my Feuer tip and, of course, catching up on the latest. And Connor McDonald has been on a streak writing some new blog posts around. Basically, hey, if you don't use PL SQL, you're writing really suboptimal applications in terms of performance, and showing if you do Java straight to the database compared to Java PL SQL database, PL SQL is vastly superior. And then I just started kind of tracking through his various blog posts, of which there are a gazillion and all really special and great. And it reminded me about 21C. So I don't know how many of you are on 21C. I am not on 21C as a development platform yet. Obviously, most of us are staying at 19, which is the long-term support release. Even Live SQL is not upgraded to 21C yet, which is strange, but there it is. Anyway, in 21C, the PL SQL team went to town on iterators. So for loops now have a tremendous amount of power and flexibility. I don't know like the 10th of it yet. I haven't even spent the time to learn yet. But here's an example of how cursor for loops have changed. So prior to 21C, I can do a cursor for loop with an embedded implicit select, or I could reference an explicit cursor. All right, here's my explicit cursor for every record in cursor. But I couldn't do that with a sys or a ref cursor, a dynamically allocated cursor. But now you can. So for example, I've got dynamic SQL. Actually, I think that cursor, okay. This is actually even more complex than simply using a ref cursor, but you can see that it works with a ref cursor. So I can use dynamic SQL inside a for loop now. So there's my SQL statement. Could be dynamic, obviously it's not here. I have to declare a record to match the columns being returned. So I can't do a % row type against the string. That's kind of the downside. And then I say for every record, this is my variable, and then you specify the type, the structure coming back, in the values of. That might sound like the for all statement with indices of and values of. And yes, the for loop has been extended to support indices of and values of syntax. And then I simply say, execute immediate the cursor right inside the parentheses for the cursor. I can even add a qualifier. This is not a where clause in the SQL. It's essentially a where clause on the rows being returned. And then I simply work with those. So let's see, I think this will work. I'm on 21C here, my little dev environment. Maybe now it needs to reconnect. So if you're on 21C, definitely check out the iterators and all the incredible functionality around them, both for SQL like this, and even more so for collection iteration, collection assignments. The applications of it are pretty extraordinary.
So Stephen, I guess that answers Rick's question. It is definitely not available in 19C then. Would that be correct?
That's correct, Rick. So big improvements in 21C, specifically around iterators. 18C had a number of really nice enhancements to PL SQL, including qualified expressions for PL SQL array structures, similar to constructs or constructor functions for nested tables and V-arrays. 19C had very little in the way of new PL SQL features. 20C never existed. And 21C is where they piled in a lot of really great stuff. But as I said, it's something that Oracle it's called an innovation release. So they're actually steering production customers away from 21C as a production platform. And I think that I could speak to things like 22C and 23C, but why would I? I don't work at Oracle anymore. So I don't know about the next release. I don't even know if there's a 22C database or 23. I think 23 is the next long-term support release, if I remember correctly from all the charts. So yeah, sorry, only 19C. And I got right. If you want to share my screen again, I can just show you that, in fact, it did work. So we can see the results. There are 3 rows from the table where employee ID is less than 103. This is Lex DeHaan, who was really an amazing Oracle consultant and developer and pre-sales guy back in the 80s and unfortunately died very young. But we still honor him in our employees table. So yeah, so lots of opportunities there. And here's an example, right, that I was going to show you before, but here's the simpler example where you can simply say, for every record in a sysref cursor in a cursor variable. So it doesn't have to be dynamic. That's the even more exciting part. I just open my cursor and then I fetch through them. So yeah, when you get to 21C or beyond, writing a lot of the complex, we're going to be able to pull out a lot of the code we would usually write in complex iteration logic.
Hashemi was questioning the 42 seconds, but I think that had to do with
the performance. Yeah, that's just like starting up in my instance or something like that. It seemed like the first step it's doing something, but yeah, that's not in the PL SQL itself. So I was just going to show you one more script, but I don't think I need to. The other thing to remember, so around cursor for loops, is that it is doing row by row. Logically, it's doing row by row, though it will be optimized to fetch 100 rows at a time if you're optimized on 10G or higher. And because of that, if you have a read-only cursor for loop, in other words, your dbms output.put line displaying stuff or some kind of report generation, who knows what, you're not doing any non-query DML, then you can probably leave it as is. If, however, there's an insert, update, delete, or merge inside that cursor for loop, and you're dealing with more than, let's say, 100 rows, then you really should do a full conversion to bulk collect and for all. You'll find lots of resources on Live SQL, also in my blog post that's coming along with this video, so you can go check out that conversion process. Non-trivial, but that's the point at which cursor for loops really will not be your friend. They will be hurting your performance overall. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. I saw that you did post a couple of links to Connor's blog.
Connor's, one of them that I found. I mentioned a couple. I'll still look for some more, but we'll make sure to put them in the description on the YouTube
yeah,
video.
There's one actually in the blog post already at the resources.
Okay, great.
So hopefully that was interesting. I'm sure a lot of you knew most of what I was talking about, but it's kind of fun to revisit. And I think also, again, just to appreciate how fortunate we are to be able to work with PL SQL. It does so much for us. It makes things so much easier for developers, and it offers just incredible performance and security for users. So it's really a great programming language, and I'm so glad that I fell into it back in 1990 or so.
And if Connor says it's true, it must be so.
Yeah. And by the way, I messaged him. Maybe I don't think he'll feel terrible about this. He's got this thing about when to have an apostrophe and when not to have an apostrophe. So usually when Connor publishes a blog post, I read it, and then I DM him on Twitter saying, here's a typo. It should be ITS, not IT apostrophe S. Anyway, he replied to me saying, well, at least I know somebody's reading my blog. So if you haven't read any of his blog posts lately, please go read his blog posts. Claudio says, select is dynamic, but record type not. Yes, so why don't you go back and share my screen for a sec?
Sure.
Let's get this out of the way. So just to make this really clear, in this new 21C, where are you? Where's my SQL developer? There we go. So in 21C, you have this incredible flexibility here with your for loop. Let's just go back even to the simpler one. So you can say, I'm going to reference this cursor in the for loop, but you have to tell it the structure of the values being returned. Now, it'd be nice. So you might say, well, why can't Oracle automatically detect that? Probably in some circumstances they can. For example, at compile time, it could figure out what it is. But if it's dynamic, and open could be for dynamic or static SQL. If it's dynamic, and certainly something like this, there's just absolutely no way at compile time to know what the structure should be, and therefore to know whether all of this is right or not. So to get your code to compile, that's necessary. Alrighty, so let's stop sharing. Let's go and talk.
Yeah,
let's
and Stephen, there was Carrie's asking if your example scripts can be downloaded. So I know you referenced a couple on Live SQL. You've also got your master repository of scripts somewhere, right?
Yeah, in general, you'll find all of this on Live SQL. I'll make sure that any of the other ones I've loaded up there as well. The 21C things you won't see there. I'll update my demo zip as well. That's available if you go to stephenfeuerstein.com, and then you can download my demo zip. And I'll update that with the 21C scripts that I just built this morning or copied from Connor in the documentation. All right.
And we'll make sure, just check back. All of these links we'll post in the description of the video here. So,
okay, so to finish things up, I want to talk about a new favorite book I've been reading. And we have in the past, prior to Putin's invasion and devastation of Ukraine, we were asking people to choose from among different environmental organizations to help save the planet. So we're going to help save the Ukraine in our little bit of a way by donating an additional $25 this week to an organization supporting Ukraine. And hopefully, well, honestly, I'm not hopeful about Putin being diverted. He's okay. Moving on from that. So my favorite book. Why don't you share my screen?
Mm-hmm.
So who has ever wondered about dreams? Where dreams come from?
Oh my gosh!
Why do they
all
work
the
the way they
time.
work? So
Why are they so bizarre? Why am I always wanting to fly?
Yeah. So I came across this book, When Brains Dream. In fact, just by accident, I was at the library. I was looking for books on Alexander technique, which I think I've talked about before here.
You have, yeah.
Pretty sure. And came across this one, and it's a brand new book, 2021, I think. And it really encapsulates all our current understanding about sleep, about dreams, and they have come up with a theory about what they think is going on in REM sleep in particular, and why humans need to dream. In fact, many creatures dream. I think there's only one form of life that we know doesn't dream. I can't remember yet. But anyway, sleeping is totally essential. So if you have any curiosity about what's going on in dreams and how we understand physiologically what's going on now, because we have an awful lot of information that we're able to glean from studies from neurology, you will be blown away. I haven't quite finished it yet, but it's already made me think differently about how I sleep, how to prepare for sleep. If you are one of those folks who don't get enough sleep, I strongly encourage you to change your life in whatever way possible to allow you to get a good night's sleep. It's not just a matter of dreaming. The things that our bodies do, that our brains do during sleep is really astonishing. Creation of insulin. So if you're pre-diabetic, if you don't get enough sleep, then you're not going to get the insulin you need, because most of it's actually produced during sleep. Alzheimer's. It looks like you're much more likely to get Alzheimer's. The indicators for Alzheimer's go way up if you don't have enough time to sleep and cleanse your brain. So incredible stuff. Check out the book, get it from the library, then buy it if it really excites you, which I just did.
I will share it with my son.
Your son? Why would your son care about that?
So if you will, oh, sorry, Sochi's going nuts here. My son has just matched to his residency program. Yesterday, he found out he is going to be a neurologist in 5 years' time. So very proud. And he'd be definitely very interested in a book about why brains
Sure, you
dream.
will. And neurology, my God, what a frontier science these days. We're learning so much and able to do so much. I'm always dreaming when my field sequel is so bad. I wonder if that's really true. What you probably do is come up with solutions to some of your coding problems while you're dreaming, and the book definitely explores that. Like, in fact, that's part of what these two guys have discovered and are postulating now, is that there's this cascading sequence of problem solving and associations that go on in your brain. And they move from the more concrete and the more strong association thinking to weaker and weaker associations, which is what happens in REM sleep. Okay, sorry. I know it's been a long time.
Karen jumps in the ocean to cleanse her brain. Karen, love it.
Good idea. All right, so we're over time. Thanks for sticking with us. Hope you had a good time this week. Check out all my recommended books and favorite cultural artifacts. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with some more tips on PL SQL. Stay safe. Stay masked. Maybe very few people are getting infected. Maybe very few people are going to the hospital. But why take a chance of that being you or your children or your grandparents or your parents? So stay safe, stay masked, and heal the planet as much as you can. All right, folks. Happy coding.
See you in a couple of
weeks.